Keir Starmer's latest reset has not gone according to plan, but has the PM turned a crisis into an opportunity? Is the BBC determined to see Nigel Farage become Prime Minister? Or are Chris Mason and Laura Kuenssberg simply crap journalists? And should 5 armed police officers be deployed to arrest an unfunny comedy writer for posting an offensive social media post? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den, and I'm joined as ever by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Not much to talk about this week, guys. Kidding, of course. It's been a fairly momentous week as far as the government are concerned. The resignation of the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, which then resulted in what was, I think, far more widespread a shake-up of the cabinet than most of us anticipated. And I would suggest, guys, that what we've seen is basically the promotion on the economic side of the government's agenda of Blairites, whilst more traditional Labour voices take over the social aspects of the challenges that the government face, things like crime, immigration and so on. Social Conservatives with a small c, the blue Labour mob, if I can put it that way. It really has been, as I said, a momentous week. So let me have your reflections on both Angela Rayner's unfortunate resignation, but then on those cabinet changes as well.
Yeah, well, there's so much to talk about. I mean, just a quick reflection to start with on Angela Rayner. She clearly broke the code of ethics, and unlike under the Boris Johnson era, when Magnus made his judgment, the Prime Minister immediately accepted it. There was none of the unseemly prevarication that we had during the Johnson era, so credit the Prime Minister for that. But, we frequently complain that the Labour Party is populated by people who've gone to university, worked as a spad, slipped into Parliament without anything in between. And so the authenticity of Angela Rayner was very valuable to Keir Starmer, just as John Prescott was to New Labour. So it is a shame that she has fallen under the wheel, so to speak. There's speculation about whether she can make a comeback in the future. I somewhat doubt it. But I think, that she obviously had an uneasy relationship with Starmer. But I think, as we call for authenticity, this is what you get with authenticity. She made mistakes. Some of the photographs of her were perhaps inappropriate for a Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But that's what you get with Angela Rayner. Authenticity is a two-sided coin. So let's park that for a moment. The reshuffle itself, it's all what's going to happen now. Joe, sparing her blushes, identified Shabana Mahmood, because I was saying last week that the search for Labour's new first female leader now resumes, and Joe said that Shabana was the candidate. Well, everything that's happened in the last week suggests that. That she's going to be very tough on the boats. And then, of course, we've got the Undertaker, as I rudely describe him, Pat McFadden, going into work and pensions, because clearly after the revolt last summer, Liz Kendall was a busted flush on that. But, is Pat McFadden a wily operator going back to the Blair years, but is he going to be able to convince the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I know, Frank, you'll have things to say about this, that welfare reform is needed, and that's going to be the test of this reshuffle, whether the immigration issue can be scotched, and whether the welfare reforms, the expenditure on welfare can be cut. And of course, the Chancellor, remains in place. It wasn't the ultimate drastic reshuffle to get the economic situation going. One last thing, a pet thing from me that nobody else is commenting on because the national commentators don't care about local government. But I think the sacking of Jim McMahon, the former leader of Oldham Council, as the local government minister is absolutely ridiculous. Jim knew about local government. They're putting through a major reform on it now. And of course, Steve Reed will now be doing that rather than Angela Rayner. Quite a tricky operation. A lot of local feeling about whether Warrington should be in with Cheshire and so on. But he was also instituting a new form of audit of local councils, which was abolished by Pickles with the Audit Commission. Jim McMahon knew all about local government, and I cannot understand why he was removed. But that I know it's not a major part of our discussion today, but those are my views on the reshuffle.
Thanks, Jim. I do want to come back to the people who've been either sideways moved, demoted, or sacked altogether, actually, because Greater Manchester fared particularly badly, I think, which may indicate some difficulties with Andy Burnham. I'm not sure. I may be reading too much into that, but we'll come back to that conversation if we may. Jo, what were your reflections on the cabinet reshuffle?
Well, I agree with you, Frank. I think Keir Starmer turned what could have been a crisis into a very good opportunity, despite the fact that every single paper, including those more sympathetic to the government, was like, oh, government in crisis. Actually, it's not. Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary is great. I think Pat McFadden, if anyone can get the reform bills through and basically tell Labour MPs either do this or just go home and forget being in government for another generation, then I don't know. I think Steve Reed to take over from Angela Rayner is really good. Of course, he's been a council leader in South London. He knows local government, and he will do that. I mean, on a personal level, I feel sad that it is always environment and farming and rural affairs that are sort of like, oh yeah, well, let's stick anybody in there. And I might be unkind to Emma Reynolds. She might be really good, but it's sort of like, really? The thing that I find astonishing, and I can't quite get my head round, is Yvette Cooper to Foreign Secretary. I think it was right to move her from the Home Office. She was tired, she was struggling, she's been in that role shadow and in government, and clearly not making any headway on immigration. And it's a massive, as we've said many times before, it's such a massive brief that probably the Home Office needs to be split into several parts. But to put her in as Foreign Secretary, particularly with Trump in the White House, she is the sort of liberal woman that he will hate. She's our version of Hillary Clinton. And I find that quite astonishing. I mean, she may well have got Peter Mandelson fighting her corner, and I know Ed Balls has got some sort of visiting professorship in Harvard, so there's reasons to do it, but it's an odd choice. Now, does that mean that Keir Starmer is going to take much more of that foreign affairs role, which he has done since they were elected, in which case it becomes a sort of almost ceremonial role, or is he going to leave her to deal with Europe? But that, I think, is a weird one. We don't have a leader of the Commons, or do we? Do we have a leader of the Commons? Somebody, or if it is, it's no one we've ever heard of. But
I think it was the whip. I think the chief whip's been moved to lead the Commons.
Okay.
Yeah, because Lucy Powell was sacked.
Yeah, but then she might become deputy leader. I mean, I think we've now got the battle for Labour. It's the deputy leadership role. Which I think was really, really important. As you said, Angela Rayner was John Prescott, if you like. Now, who do you get to be the leader? Because it is about the party as much as the government. And we've already got unions, understandably worrying that Peter Kyle and Steve Reed and the new ministers are going to water down what Angela Rayner was pushing forward on employment rights. So I think there are battles ahead within the Labour Party, but I think what they need to do is to keep those private and just get on and show the public that they can do stuff.
Yeah. Good luck with that. I mean, I think that there's a lot to unpick. Obviously, an awful lot has happened, but let's just take some of those changes that have happened then. And the one name that's not been raised yet is David Lammy, who, of course, has become Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Justice. I have to confess, I'm not a massive fan of Lammy, but apparently he's good in the Commons. So obviously he is the guy who will in future be standing in for the Prime Minister when he's not available to do Prime Minister's questions. But when you consider that the government has lost this authentic northern working class woman, and you've replaced her with another metropolitan politician, I wonder how that will be seen by the country and indeed the party, to be fair. Turning to some of the other appointments, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think you can see where Keir Starmer wants the direction of travel to be, and that's towards a far more Blairite approach to the economy. And so Peter Kyle, as you say, Joe, on workers' rights, and I tell you, if anything needs watering down, it's those reforms to employment law, because they will have a huge and negative impact on business, particularly SMEs. That's something we'll come back to in future weeks. But I hope Peter Kyle is seriously looking at those proposed legislative changes. Pat McFadden obviously has been sent in to say to Labour MPs, grow up, because we've got a huge black hole, far too many people claiming benefits who should and could be in work, and our job is to make sure that people do go to work. It's called the Labour Party, not the fucking unemployed party. So I think Pat McFadden will be saying to his backbench MPs, grow up, because the Chancellor has a huge challenge, but equally it's the right thing to do anyway. We need to get people back into work. Steve Reid, I agree with you, Joe, very, very able politician with a strong background, Jim, in local government, to be fair to him. So he's taking over that devolution brief. Alison McGovern has been moved into that department as well. So again, has served as a councillor, albeit relatively briefly in London. But we'll see this as her opportunity to shine. And obviously the housing brief is crucially important to the government. Somebody really does need to get a grip of that and start to crack on. And then, as I say, on the social side of what we would call the government's agenda, and in particular the big issue at the moment, immigration, Shabana Mahmood would appear to be the one appointment that most people are saying that is really a smart move. And even Michael Gove has basically said, you know, she is the rising star, and she means business and will be trouble for the right. So overall, I think, quite pleased with most of the changes made. We haven't mentioned, of course, Darren Jones, who we talked about this last Monday, of course, be part of Keir Starmer's team now. Some are saying the real Deputy Prime Minister, because he will be in number 10 in all of the briefings, doing the press, doing the media rounds. He's already started doing that on Friday and did a very good job from what I saw. And that then, as you said, Joe, rightly, brings us to a deputy leadership campaign. The National Executive Committee will decide today what the timetable for that contest will be. I just say this to the Labour Party: be very careful. If you are seen to be indulging in an internal battle for the soul of the Labour Party, when the country faces so many challenges and difficulties, then forget the next election, because you will be dead in the water. You will not be forgiven. And I'm already seeing comments from people who I've got a lot of time for, Emily Thornberry, Lou Haig, one or two others, suggesting that this is basically, you know, vote for me because I'm going to clip Starmer's wings. I'm going to send the government in a different direction. I personally, if I was on the National Executive Committee, would be arguing to scrap the post anyway. I think it's a nonsensical post. I think you've got a party chairman who can take the responsibility for campaigning, engaging with the membership and the trade unions. Why do we need a deputy leader? So, and by the way, Jim shakes his head. Well, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was quite keen to get rid of that position as well. And the left, the hard left of the party, supported him at that time. I'm not sure they'll be as keen this time around. But I do, on a serious note, really feel that if Labour get themselves embroiled in a deputy leadership battle, and if they are stupid enough to elect somebody who is seen as polar opposite to Keir Starmer or a critic of Keir Starmer, then this government is finished. Jim?
Well, you're right about Corbyn. I mean, that was a move to stop Tom Watson by the Corbynistas. It was a very opportunistic thing and completely hypocritical, because the argument here is, do you let democracy flourish, or do you adopt the pragmatic approach, which you, of course, have brilliantly illustrated? I doubt if the National Executive are going to, because they'd have to put a constitutional amendment, presumably to this conference, although sometimes it's too late now for this year. But I mean, I imagine they would be able to put it to this year's conference to abolish the posts. And then, you know, that in itself could create the sort of damage that you fear. So I think probably, you know, the position will be kept in place. Then the question is, who's going to stand? Now, the first thing to say is, because the Parliamentary Labour Party is so large, the threshold, the MPs have to endorse the candidate. So every candidate, as I understand it, needs the support of 80 MPs. And whilst we saw the welfare rebellions in the summer, Frank, you may get your way in terms of sanity at that point, where the only candidates approved are ones that are broadly going to support the leader rather than engage in internal warfare. But, you know, there's always a chance. You know, there's a lot of scepticism. We were astonished at the behaviour of the Parliamentary Labour Party over welfare reform that severely embarrassed the government. So it's possible that, you know, some of these candidates are being touted will get through, and there will be a contest, and you can describe it as a suicidal exercise in trying to lose the next election, or a wonderful exercise in democracy. I mean, there is a slight middle position I'd put, which is that, you know, there is a case for having, and I don't think you're saying this, Frank, but a case for having somebody who's in a relationship, as Prescott was to Blair, to have somebody there who's, you know, a bit critical, keeping the person in line without being unduly aggressive. But, you know, then we would come on to who's that going to be. I mean, obviously, it's possible that the leadership will put up someone like a Lammy to do it, or somebody like that. But obviously,
well, surely you've got to have if you're going to have a deputy leader, and I agree with you, it's highly unlikely that they're going to have the bottle to say we're going to scrap the position, and it would cause an unholy row at conference. Timetable wise, I'd be trying to kick the can down the road and at least give themselves until the next party conference, by which time you would hope that this 99.3 set that Starmer has just pressed the button on will start to show some results. But apparently they're saying no, you know, it's going to be through the autumn. So it'd have to be a female, wouldn't it?
Well, it's got to be a woman, and as Harriet Harman said this morning, and I think other people have said as well, it's got to be somebody not from London. I mean, because the other thing that we haven't mentioned in the reshuffle is the person who wasn't reshuffled, which is Rachel Reeves, who is now absolutely rock solid, one would assume, even if he had been thinking about getting shot of her. Because he won't now, and the return of Douglas Alexander to cabinet, which, you know, has cost the loss of his Scottish colleague. But you know, if you are going to have a deputy leader, then it's got to be, you know, maybe Lucy Powell was leader of the Commons, you know, popular. But I think, you know, this is such a key moment for the government, and they need to be thinking, and the timing is ghastly with a Labour conference coming up, but they need to be thinking about the people they are speaking to in the country, not just members of the Labour Party, because there are an awful lot of people, millions of people, who gave them the benefit of the doubt. And now those doubts are overshadowing because they haven't seen any benefit.
Lou Hague, I mean, Lou Hague's the one they fear, because she's not sort of Richard Bergen or Dawn Butler, who are the hard left people that are being suggested. That Lou Hague, who left, in difficult circumstances over a mobile phone, if you remember. But she is quite popular on the soft left, Frank. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think Andy Burnham has said that he would be happy to support Lou Haig or Lucy Powell. But I think that opens up that obvious attack line from the opposition and from the right-wing media that Keir Starmer has got somebody sat as his deputy leader in the party who is basically unfriendly to his agenda and unfriendly to him. And so the speculation about Keir Starmer's future is then front and centre of political discussion and debate. It's just not helpful. So if we do have to have this nonsensical contest, and I guess, as I say, that we will, then my preferred candidate would be Shabana Mahmood. Because if you're going to have somebody who is good on the media, clearly part of the Starmer team, in charge of what is got to be seen at this moment in time, a critical issue that is immigration, more so than the economy at the moment. I don't think that will be the case by the time we get to the next election, but certainly at this point in time it is. She would seem to me to be a really credible candidate. She's a Birmingham MP, of course, so it comes with that added bonus of her not being from London, Joe, and a woman of colour, which would be good to see as well. So I think that she has an awful lot to sell if she chooses to go for the deputy leadership. And if she's going to do that, and if the NEC is minded to set its timetable today, then again, my view would be to say, get Mahmood or your favoured candidate out there early and start rallying the troops, rallying support, and again, try and persuade the Parliamentary Labour Party to grow up, be mature, and just back one candidate. So there isn't actually a contest. Other thing that we haven't mentioned, you're looking at north of £2 million to have that election. And at the moment, the Labour Party is not flush with cash. So there's all sorts of reasons why people like Jim and his pro-democracy drum banging away there, more so I have to tell you, his journalistic juices, because they love an internal squabble, an internal fight, and being able to say who's up and who's down to the press. But from the country's perspective and from the party's perspective, much, much more sensible if we simply had one candidate that people could get behind you.
I think Shabana Mahmood shouldn't do it. She's got too much on her hands. She needs to be concentrating on the big issues at the Home Office. I mean, the other person who's being mentioned this morning is Jess Phillips, who, of course, very popular in the Labour Party, not doing particularly well in her ministerial role. Great friends of Angela Rayner's. I think they used to share a flat together. And I just think, somebody like that. I mean, the Labour Party have moved probably too quickly. They've given till 5 o'clock on Thursday for the deadline for nominations.
Oh, they announced it. Sorry, yeah. I missed that. Right.
So you sort of think, okay, you could have just said, I tell you what, we'll leave it until after conference. We'll discuss it at conference. We'll go through the motions. And as you say, Frank, leave it until the next conference. But then you've got rumblings going on. And in a way, I suppose you rip the plaster off. But Jess Phillips could be a unity.
Jess Phillips is a good shout, actually. And in terms of, not wishing to pigeonhole people here, but in terms of profile, she's probably the parliamentarian who you would say is as like Angela Rayner as anyone else. Jim, not a bad shout, that.
Yeah, just apart from exposing my journalistic appetite for contests, which I have to admit to, the only thing I would say about coronations is that it sort of did for Gordon Brown to some extent. You remember the incredible pressure that was put on the party not to have a contest after Tony Blair finished, and Gordon was.
We're talking about a ceremonial role, Jim, aren't we? I mean, even if they elected, let's say, Lou Haig. Okay, let's say that the party decided to elect Lou Haig. And I like Lou Haig. I think she did a good job. And as I said at the time, I thought it was ridiculous that she was forced to resign on the issue that she was told to fall on a sore for. But Keir Starmer doesn't have to give her any senior job in government. He certainly wouldn't make a deputy prime minister. So what benefit is there to the government or the party to have a contest? We are not talking about the Labour Party doing what the Conservatives done for consecutive leadership contests and basically impose a new prime minister on the country. We're talking about a position here, Jim, that for anyone in the country outside of the 300,000 members of the Labour Party is not worth a fucking hill of beans. So don't be trying to compare this to electing a prime minister. You're talking about electing an administrative post within the Labour Party that, in my view, is antiquated anyway, and a personality, an individual, a person who the prime minister does not need to give a senior job to.
I think what's at the heart of this is what we've been hearing over the last few days is that for whatever reason that Starmer and his number 10 allies have not listened enough to their MPs and perhaps the Labour Party in the country. My only fear about your proposal is that if you lock down that position, that opportunity for people to express their views, then you've got to make very sure that you change your direction in terms of listening to your MPs, respecting what they say, whilst trying to get through the policies. Now, you can say that actually listening to the parliamentary party, they'll say no welfare cuts, and therefore,
well, exactly,
it's okay. But if this isn't handled properly, if it's seen as a shutdown of the membership, they're not allowed to have their deputy leader of the Labour Party. If it's done in the wrong way, it could just try and put the kettle on, unease in the party. Now, that can all be solved if the economy improves and so on. But if not, you've got to be careful about trying to crush dissent in the party, because it'll find some way to emerge. That's my only reservation.
Let me just ask you then, Jim, on a serious note. So let's say Lou Haig is elected. She's clearly fallen out with Keir Starmer. She clearly has the ear of an awful lot of soft left and then hard left MPs if she became deputy leader of the Labour Party. Where does that leave the government?
Well, the government's in a difficult position anyway. I mean, you can't. You want a complete change of heart of rank and file Labour people who expected a Labour government to employ social justice, not bear down on disabled people, not get too close to the Donald Trump, and some of those things. And for some of them, all the defence expenditure is outrageous. They're not happy with the direction of the Labour Party.
So I ask you again, Jim, where does that leave the Labour government? It basically means that they're heading very fast at a rate of knots towards opposition for, as Joe said, a generation, because all of those issues, right? Let's fall out with Trump. Great. Tariffs of 50%. See where that takes your economy. Let's not spend on defence. Great. We're now exposed to Putin, China, and the rest of the undemocratic geopolitical forces that we are having to fend off at this moment in time. Let's not cut welfare. Fantastic. Already we saw gilt markets last week go to 27-year highs as far as our interest rates were concerned. So if you're telling me, Jim, that what we need to do is listen to people who would sign up for all of that nonsense, then I'm saying to you, it's time the Prime Minister and his allies and the grown-ups in the Labour Party faced them down. And one way of clearly indicating that they are prepared to do that is to say, we don't want a contest for the deputy leadership if at all possible. We want this particular candidate in place. If there's got to be a contest, then I hope that the Labour Party has the sense to elect somebody who is aligned to Starmer. I fear that with all the machinations of the trade unions, and as you say, activists who never get these things right, that's why they're political activists. If they were sort of Joe blogs and Jane blogs, then you'd have a far more common sense approach to things. Anybody who's involved in politics, myself included, got a bit loony You two demonstrate this every week as well. So allowing somebody, allowing 300,000 people to say, well, this is the future you govern your country. It's crackers. It's absolutely crackers.
No, I'm
It's
sure you're
also
right. And of course, they have those people have the ability now. They have the choice. They can go off to Mr. Polanski in the Green Party, or they can go off with the Corbynites, and then we'll see what is left of the Labour. We haven't got time for this big debate today, but there's a fascinating discussion which we must have sometime about what may be going on is the complete realignment of politics, where you've got a hard right party and hopefully a sort of party around the Liberals and Conservatives, and then the problem I have is where the Labour Party's future is in any case. But your will may prevail, Frank. It's common sense.
It won't. No, Jim, I have no confidence that the argument I'm presenting will be taken up by the leadership. But I think the consequences could potentially be that we see an already struggling government simply getting itself into more turmoil. And if you look back over the past 13, 14 months, the vast majority of difficulties that is faced have been self-inflicted, Joe. And we seem determined to inflict yet another self-inflicted wound on ourselves.
Yeah, and I will absolutely push back on Jim, because I know he likes a contest, but I just think, actually it is anti-democratic for the Labour government, given the problems that the country faces domestically and globally, to engage in some ridiculous internecine war about the future of the Labour Party. Get on with the job that people elected you to do, and don't bugger about with your own internal machinations, because that's what the Tories did. And Labour can't afford to do it. And it is high time. And this idea that, he doesn't listen. Well, he did listen. And look what happened on welfare reform. Everything ends up going, oh, all right, it's a bit hard. Well, let's not do that then. We'll just tweak it around the edges. No, you need to actually get on and do the things that people who may not be Labour Party members elected you to do.
Let's just have one final word on the government, because it was an excellent blog that you wrote for Friday's TFI Bulletin, Jim, and that was on the Chancellor's decision to push the budget back until the 26th of November. Like you, I think that leaves her open to all the speculation, the kite flying. Of course, the rationale is that the OBR need to basically check her homework and make sure that the claims that she is making in terms of the proposals that she's going to bring forward are correct, fine and dandy, and they need 10 weeks apparently to do that. But like you, I am concerned that we are going to see, as I say, all of those hairs running, and in that period, of course, businesses, confidence of the business community already pretty shaky, becomes even more unstable.
Yes, it's extraordinary. The events since I wrote the blog, have been completely overtaken, and we've taken our eye off the economic ball. But I do think late November, when I said in my blog, we're putting up the Christmas decorations, it's very late for the budget, particularly because business is watching so carefully to see what the Chancellor is going to do in the terrible dilemma that she's in. And I'm very surprised that the late October idea, which was the original one, is not happening. So we've got 2 months at least of uncertainty for business, which I think will have an effect. And I mean, I hear what you say, that it's going to take the Office of Budget Responsibility 10 weeks to do the budget. Is that because half of them are working from home? I mean, come on. work day and night, that's not an excuse.
No, I don't think it's an excuse. I'm just saying that's what the rationale that has been offered is. And Joe, for me, it almost feels a little bit like, let's hope something turns up. Yeah. That's my fear in terms of why it's being pushed back. So I may be being a little unfair, but that's what I'm sort of thinking.
No, well, the OBR thing I think is true, although, Jim is beginning to sound a bit like Jacob Rees-Mogg being rather snippy about are they all working from home. Obviously, Jim, we're all doing this from remote locations because we're not in the downtown office.
I'm in the office. I'm in the office.
Yeah,
Chris is
but
in
you're
the
the boss. You're allowed. You have to be. But I do think there's an element of, oh, let's hope things improve, and they may well do, but of course they might not. Something ghastly could fall out of the sky. Who knows? But we are where we are, and she is there for the duration.
The gilt markets, by the way, I did mention them before because the interest on those bonds went to record levels last week, but have come down significantly since, and are actually back to the norm, as is the pound. The value of the pound has spiked again. Sorry. So I've not seen any headlines telling us that, but of course, every time there's a downturn, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, and others are screaming and can't wait to tell us. But when it turns around, they're not as eager to let us know. But that is the job of Darren Jones now, to make sure that people are hearing any good news stories that emanate from the government. He's going to have a hell of a task, though, if, as I say, the Labour Party embroil itself in a deputy leadership contest. But it seems they have pressed the button, and so we will see what emerges over the next few days in terms of who those runners and riders may be. I mentioned Emily Thornberry, by the way. Emily is joining one of downtown's fringe events at Labour Conference in a couple of weeks' time. So it'll be interesting to see if she's going for the deputy leadership, and see what other names may or may not emerge. Sorry, the final thing I wanted to make this point and ask your guys' views on this. James, you mentioned Jim McMahon. I think that was a heartfelt criticism from you in terms of his sacking. Lucy Powell, of course, was sacked. Lucy, again, just declaring interest here. I get on famously with Lucy. I think she was doing a fine job as leader of the Commons, actually very good on her feet. Sharp sense of humour, and we've worked with her for many years now downtown in business. So I was really sorry to see Lucy lose her job. Then we had Johnny Reynolds, who I know you're a big fan of, Jim, moved from business to the Whip's office. That would be seen in parliamentary terms as a sideways move, but I think he'll be a bit disappointed with that particular move. The thing all of those MPs and, of course, Angela Rayner have in common is they represent Greater Manchester seats. So am I being a bit too conspiratorial, Jim, in thinking this could be something to do with their close proximity to the king across the water, Andy Burnham?
Well, he did an interview on Kuenssberg yesterday, which certainly distanced himself from the Prime Minister, saying, he's picking up this theme about the government needs to listen, and also expressing concern about the sort of London flavour of the government. Now, Andy's always steered a fairly careful line without being outrightly disloyal to Keir Starmer, but nevertheless being a critic. And it could well be that it's irritating the Prime Minister. And speculation continues about what Andy Burnham's long-term plans are. But it is it has been a bad weekend really for North West MPs. I mean, Maria Eagle's out, Justin Madders from the Chester area, he's out of the government, and Johnny Reynolds I thought was doing a pretty good job at business. Apparently, he's a very collegiate guy. And that's what you need in a chief whip. Come on, lads, get behind, lads and lasses, get behind the government here. So I'm sure his personality will serve him well in the whip's office. But, one continues to be fascinated by Andy Burnham, and you're identifying the ripple effects of his position.
Well, it flashed through my mind for only a nanosecond when Angela Rayner resigned. I thought, well, if she then decides to step down as an MP, does that leave a nice, safe seat?
Well, when you consider the sort of wider implications of what has happened this week, and you look at the devolution agenda, as we closely do, of course, Jim and I in particular, obsessed with this stuff. Angela Rayner for the next mayor of Greater Manchester as Andy takes his way to Westminster.
Nice swap.
The thing is about the Greater Manchester situation is that other than Andy, you'd be hard pressed to see who else could fend off a challenge from reform at the moment. But Angela Rayner potentially could.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting they're going to swap jobs or anything like that, but when you're looking about whether or not Angie makes a comeback into frontline politics, then she could do worse than look at that job in the future if Andy does decide to go for a Westminster seat again. Final point on this whole situation, which was triggered by Angela Rayner's resignation. I do think it's a shame that she has had to leave frontline politics, and I do hope it's temporary. But it wouldn't surprise me if once she's taken a few weeks, a few months off, bit of a sabbatical, she actually decides, bugger this. I can probably go off and earn myself some cash now in the private sector. I can go on speaking circuits. I can do myself a podcast, which will get plenty of advertising revenues. The treatment that Angela Rayner had during the whole career in politics, but certainly since she became deputy leader of the Labour Party and then subsequently, of course, Deputy Prime Minister, has been absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
And I put a post on, a very, I thought, uncontroversial post on LinkedIn over the weekend, basically saying I was sorry to see such an authentic voice having to move out of frontline politics and wishing her all the best for the future. You should have seen some of the vitriolic, misogynist and classist comments that I had back in response to that particular post. Absolutely disgraceful. So I do hope that Angela Rayner comes back into frontline politics, but I would well understand if she decided enough is enough. I'll concentrate on basically earning my living outside of that cauldron that is now politics and go and do something else more, well, easier in terms of your personal life and anxiety.
Or become the mayor of Greater Manchester, unless Keir Starmer completely destroys the Labour Party. And then Andy Burnham comes in, and that would be marvellous, wouldn't it?
That could be the answer, but I think, as we know, these things are never as easy as they may sound. Anyway, listen, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the BBC's favourite political party, Reform. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. So we've talked all things Labour Party in the first part of this week's pod, but of course, Reform had their annual conference in Birmingham this week. We were subjected to Andrea Jenkins singing her own ditty to a bemused group of delegates in the hall, which I have to say looked fairly sparse in terms of its attendance. But there was Andrea blasting out her latest, shall we say, hit. She was followed, of course, by Nadine Dorries being wheeled out to talk about how, when in government, poor Boris got done in and she was the only one who defended him, and Boris should be able to join the Reform Party. We then had an anti-vax doctor telling the audience that the royal family had been basically open to getting cancer from their COVID jabs, and he was widely applauded by some of the lunatics who were in the conference hall. Then they rolled out Lucy Connolly, the woman who put out that wonderful tweet during the Southport riots, encouraging people to go to hotels that had asylum seekers, including children in them, of course, and burn the bastards down. Nice woman is Lucy. And then we had Andrea coming back to finish off with a rendition of God Save the King. Oh no, God Save the Queen, she sang. Well, the reaction of the BBC's senior political correspondent to this fantastic array of events was to say, reform, get ready for government. And then, of course, Laura Kuenssberg did her usual sycophantic interview with Nigel Farage on her flagship Sunday programme. So the question is, why are the BBC so keen to see Nigel Farage in 10 Downing Street? I've never quite seen anything like it, and just hats off at this point, because I don't want to come across as a journalist basher. I thought Beth Rigby did a fabulous job duffing up Farage in the interview she did with him a couple of days previously, and really did make him squirm over his affairs in terms of stamp duty, tax and so on, and this claim that he made the general election that he bought a house in Clacton, his constituency, of course. Turns out that it wasn't him who bought the house in Clacton, but his partner, thus meaning that Mr. Farage did not have to pay stamp duty. Oh, to have a rich woman. Hey, James.
Well, yes, I mean, Laura Kuenssberg asked the question, and Farage said his partner had bought the house. Where's the crime? I mean, I think that was an answer to that question. But let's turn to the more
bloody hell! I tell you what, I'd hate to face such fierce questioning, would you, Jim, about my tax affairs? Oh man, oh well, my wife bought it. Oh, okay, then let's move on then. Now,
well,
how many immigrants are you gonna get over here? Oh, come on.
She then moved on to say, will you, like other party leaders, publish your personal tax affairs? So she asked that question. He said
no.
He said no. Well, so is she then meant to make some sort of comment?
Yes.
Oh, she does.
No, the BBC don't comment. No, the BBC don't comment on what politicians say. That would be crossing a line.
I think I'll have to watch some video footage of her interviewing other people.
Jim, come on. You can ask a question without commenting and say, okay, so you say no. Why not? Don't the public have a right to know about politicians, particularly those that are seeking the highest office in the land? Don't the public have a right to know about their tax affairs? Because you then have a whole conversation about privacy.
Well, he did. Well, he did. He said that he thought that was a step too far in terms of his own privacy. She had the dilemma: do you carry on with that aspect of the conversation when she wanted to go on to question him about other things, where she got an admission from him that he'd welcomed in Nadine Dorries, they'd had great differences before from the Conservative Party, because she would bring the experience which he fully admitted the Reform Party didn't have. So I thought Kuenssberg got quite a journalistic nugget out of that, getting him to confess that they lack experience at the moment, which opens up a whole can of worms of criticism of Reform UK, which can be developed over the forthcoming period. So I thought, in that respect, she got an interesting answer out of him.
So Nadine Dorries, sorry,
Joe, go on.
Well, I'm just going to say Nadine Dorries bringing experience of government. I mean, Nadine Dorries, when she was appointed Culture Secretary, I remember Robert Harris, the fabulous author, put a tweet out and he said, I've dragged my sorry arse across this earth for 64 years to see Nadine Dorries made Culture Secretary. I feel like giving up, or something along those lines. I mean,
but we're debating that, and that's the point. The BBC's role is to attract that sort of critique and scrutiny of reform, but that's exactly what we're doing now as a result of her interview, which has exposed that the only person he's got to sort of bring experience to his party is a woman who's got the faults that you're outlining. So we're talking on the narrow point of whether the BBC are doing their job or not. That's
okay. Well,
no, I honestly, Jim, I think that you've got to look at the tone of the reporting from Mason and Kuenssberg. Mason has got worse, actually. It seemed to me that he was determined to paint this conference as this wonderful convention, successful government in waiting, a plan of action to move forward on all the big issues and challenges facing the country. Didn't mention the economic bubble that was burst, and Tice actually said, actually all of those promises, no, we're not going to do any of those. Didn't mention the 99 U-turns Farage has done since the immigration speech that he made a couple of weeks ago. He's backtracked massively on all of those. But the big thing, surely, in the week when the Deputy Prime Minister resigned on the basis that she got badly advised on a property matter, ought to have been the fact that he, who aspires to be our next Prime Minister, deliberately misled the public, or perhaps misspoke, when he said and claimed only 12 months ago that he had bought a property in Clacton. And you do not have to be Einstein to understand and appreciate that by putting that property in his partner's name enabled him to avoid stamp duty. Now, I would have thought that Laura Kuenssberg, as limited as she is, in my opinion, would have had the nous to say to him, does that not just look a little bit fishy, Mr. Farage? That's all you're looking for, Jim. A little bit of pushback, rather than this nodding dog act that we get from it. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. That's all I'm saying, Jim. And I would absolutely wager with you the fact that if Keir Starmer or any of the other front bench, in fact, any of the Conservative shadow cabinet, come on and perform like that, she would be roughing them up. And she just doesn't with Farage. And Chris Mason is almost sycophantic towards reform now. It's ridiculous.
Well, I have got Chris Mason's article in front of me, and I must admit that there is nothing in here about the economic thing. It is, it's a vastly bigger gathering. It feels like a big party conference. In another corner of the exhibition hall, there's stands for all 10 regions, growing professionalism. Then at the end, he says that Farage is calling for discipline is what he wants. Nigel Farage has a focus and sense of purpose I haven't seen in the best part of 2 decades of reporting on him. So, it omits references to the economic thing. So you have a point there. I generally think Chris Mason's impeccably impartial, because if you listen to him speaking about any issue, he always does this, some say this and some say that, trying to steer a course through the middle. So I think that's being a bit unfair to Chris.
Okay. When he was talking about professionalism, Joe, was he talking about the Mayor Andrea Jenkins and a karaoke performance on the stage? Was he talking about the anti-vaxxer who was claiming that members of the royal family had contracted cancer through the COVID vaccination? Or was he talking about Lucy Connolly saying that she was going to go in and reform prisons because of her experience in that prison system after that woeful and disgraceful tweet that she issued? Or was he talking about the fact that Richard Tice basically tore up their whole economic strategy and said that he'd have to go back and speak to his girlfriend in Dubai to talk about what he should do next? I don't know what professionalism means if Chris Mason thinks that's a professional political conference. And I know you've got a lot of time for Chris Mason as well, but honestly, I just, as I say, found the reporting on the Reform Conference from the BBC last week totally and utterly ridiculous.
I think I do have a much higher regard for Chris Mason than you do. I have absolutely no regard for Laura Kuenssberg and never have had, actually. But I do think there is an element of stardust has blinded the BBC. And when anybody writes in to complain about their excessive, disproportionate or easy coverage of reform, the answer they get back, because I know many people who've done it and I've seen the replies, is, oh, but we are reflecting the millions of votes that they got at the last election and the fact that they're doing high in the polls. Well, I can tell you from working for a third party for quite a lot of my adult life, your ratings go up the more coverage you get. So the more coverage you get, the more the ratings go up. So that is a nonsense argument. And the fact that they got millions of votes, well, so did the Liberal Democrats, actually, so did the Greens. I think there are many questions that reform need to answer. And you need to a certain extent take Nigel Farage out of the equation, because there is no doubt, we all agree, he's a brilliant performer, he's a great communicator, he knows how to work, and he's a very shrewd political operator. Nick Robinson gave Richard Tice a really hard time, which I was very glad to hear one day last week. But there needs to be more scrutiny of things like Reform Council in Nottinghamshire banning their councillors from talking to the local paper, the Nottingham Evening Post, at the same time as they're talking about free speech. Where are the questions about why was Nigel Farage in America giving evidence, to some, non-statutory committee talking about the free speech in this country, when they had rescinded the pass for the bloke from the New World to attend their own party conference? That's sort of basic stuff that any of us can pick up from what we do, reading papers and listening to the news. And the BBC seems to fail abysmally to just pick on those little things. Why is it that some reform councils are now having to write to the Home Secretary and say, actually, we need you to extend the visas because we've got a huge shortage of care workers, at the same time as they're talking about, and why is Nigel Farage saying, I'm going to stop the boats in 2 weeks? Well, the only way you can do that is if you can manipulate the weather and have a storm for 2 weeks.
And Laura Kuenssberg got a retraction of that. He had to row back on his pledge to do it in 2 weeks. Laura Kuenssberg extracted from him the fact that legislation would have to go through and it would be months before he could redeem his promise. And the BBC gave considerable coverage to the backtracking that Farage had to do on that issue. Can I just widen this out just more generally? So John Curtis, the psephologist who I think we all respect, made a very important statement about British politics, which refers to our discussion. The thing that Reform are capitalising on is a loss of confidence, not only in the Labour government, but also in the Conservative opposition. And that is very unusual, probably since the heydays of the SDP Liberal Alliance in 1982. So that's what they're capitalising on. They've managed to get cross-party a large number of people who are concerned about immigration, people on benefits, wokery, and residually Brexit, bringing them together, and that's why they are popular. And when we're discussing how the BBC should cover that phenomenon, but it is a major phenomenon in British politics that we need to think about.
Sorry, Joe, go on.
Well, only to say, but the other point is, when Nigel Farage says, oh, England is like, or Britain is like North Korea, he's got his own TV show on a national channel which promotes reform and Nigel Farage, of which I'm not part of that promotion, but I am part of that programme, as a lone voice going, but hang on a minute. And nobody ever seems to, and I think
she did. She challenged him on the North Korean thing, and he had no answer. He more or less said, "I say things to cause discussion to take place." She had him on that.
Well, all I can say, Jim, is you've got much more patience than I have, because I can't bear to watch her.
Yeah, I mean, we ordinarily would have done a deeper dive into the Reform Conference and indeed Nigel Farage's performance in the United States, which was treacherous, actually. He was going over to America to try and persuade his mate Donald to put higher tariffs on us, which of course would trash our economy, cost jobs, and damage the people that Nigel Farage says he's here to defend. And the free speech thing is a nonsense, we know that. But anybody who's looking from the BBC or anywhere else as to how to take apart Nigel Farage and Reform simply needs to watch that clip of Jamie Raskin the American senator, who absolutely tore Nigel Farage a new one. It was a pleasure to see. And it's just a shame that our journalists, particularly, as I say, those who work for what used to be the premier news outlet and organisation of not just the United Kingdom, but I would suggest the world, how far it has fallen. As I say, I think it's really depressing to see. I'd also say, before the unexpected cabinet shake-up happened, we did hear rumours that two other Northern cabinet members, the Education Minister Bridget Phillipson and Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy, their positions were potentially going to be under threat. Of course, both have survived, and I do wonder whether Lisa needs to get her elbows out and be a bit firmer with the BBC, given its ridiculous coverage of reform. As I say, I mean, I might be going all North Korean myself here, but I do think that Lisa Nandy and the government need to be far tougher with the BBC in terms of the coverage it's given to Nigel Farage and his band of merry men and women.
I think the broader picture is that whatever you think about it, and I always have in mind that the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph have a commercial interest in bringing down the BBC. It's not the general criticisms that you're making. Every single day, whether it's their drama productions or anything else, they are constantly trying to chip away at the BBC because they want the BBC abolished for commercial reasons in their own interest. So that we need to bear that in mind. And also that in the broader context, I think you probably would agree with the World Service and everything else, in a world of increasing lies, poisonous social media, that the BBC, in my opinion, is still one of the huge assets of this country, and that therefore Lisa Nandy is moderated in her approach to criticising Director General.
Yeah, as I say, I think we need to get a bit tougher with them, but there you go. You see, I will be a bit more North Korea with our media if I was in charge, so there you go. I think you've got to fight fire with fire sometimes. So, right, we're going to take another very, very short break. We'll be back to talk about this controversy over the unfunny comedian who got arrested at Heathrow. Stay with us. We'll be back in a sec. Well, welcome back to the final part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Just an issue that we probably would have spent far more time discussing in a normal week, but of course, so much has happened. Graham Linehan, the writer of Father Ted, posted a rather offensive tweet, or X, whatever you call it these days, and was then subjected to an arrest by 5 armed police officers. Now, for context, this guy has got a fairly long track record of anti-trans posts, and I think he's up in court shortly, Joe, on some sort of charge or other against something in terms of an offence he's committed against a trans woman. So what's your take on this situation?
Obviously, it's Heathrow Airport. You've got armed police. You've got an incident, I believe, on the aircraft shortly after it landed. So that is not the same as something happening, down the road in the high street. You've got a different level of potential security. So I get all of that. But I do think, 5 armed officers to arrest some bloke it wasn't, I don't even know who reported him, but it is quite ridiculous. And there are several things here. One is that just feeds into the nonsense about us being like North Korea and the free speech thing, which is damaging and dangerous and silly. But the other thing is, which is the much more important bit, is actually, while that's going on, there's some poor person who's got a shop that's just had, 5 shoplifters in who have walked off with no sign of any police. Or, you can call whatever the number is to report something. Well, you're lucky if you get through. And then you can leave a message. And if you're lucky, somebody will come back to you about kids catapulting animals, which happened to a friend of mine recently. So this is about proportionality. I don't think the boss of the Metropolitan Police should be blaming the law. He needs to use his common sense about deployment of his officers. And I think that, you know, policing and trust in policing is at a very, very low level. And all the time, these things, obviously, they're going to get a lot of coverage, and they're going to get coverage from a, you know, as we often say, a right wing and unsympathetic press that's sort of anti-wokery and all the rest of it. There are already lots and lots of laws that exist about, you know, incitement to violence, public order, etc., etc., etc. But this whole thing about the Twitter sphere is a bit bonkers. The other thing, just on the same topic, in a way, 900 people arrested over the weekend at the Palestine Action protest in London. So I've written about this in a blog a couple of weeks ago. Palestine Action, what a joke. It's not doing anything for Palestine. All those people there had to do was to hold up posters saying, you know, I'm against genocide, I support Palestine. If they hadn't got action underneath that last word, they wouldn't have been arrested. How much effort, time and resource is it going to take to process those arrests? You know, and we're not doing anything to help Palestine. We've got a whole load of very nice, well-meaning people now caught up in the manipulation by that group to be supporting the group, and it getting all bogged down in the whole free speech thing instead of doing something about Palestine. And I think that's where it all gets muddled. We lose sight of what is the actual issue, whether it's trans rights or, you know, women's rights, as actually Graham Linehan was saying, or whether it's Palestine or it's about, you know, the right to protest.
Jim?
I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the lack of confidence in the police. You know, the shoplifting, for instance, is making people feel desperate. I'd hate to be a shopkeeper, just seeing people looting my shop and the police giving them a crime number. You know, there is a clear issue here, and there's a sort of slight suspicion that it's easier to police demonstrations because you know where they're going to take place, whereas shoplifting is ubiquitous across the country and tests the resources of the police. But I just want to make one point in defence of the police, both in the two things that Joe's mentioned, Palestine Action and trans rights. These are, you know, there are laws in this country, as Joe has very clearly explained, but to a greater extent, I would say, over Palestine Action, and to a lesser extent, well, maybe not lesser extent, but anyway, with Palestine Action and trans rights, these are what one would describe as contested social areas, huge areas of debate in our society about the merits of Palestine Action and Gaza and all that, and the rights of trans people. And I think Sir Mark Rowley was a sort of cri de coeur from him, saying that there is a difference between, you know, arresting burglars and murderers and things like that, and then getting into this public forum space. Now, I don't have a ready answer to that, but I think that's what he was talking about, and saying that it is difficult for the police, where there is social division in this country, political debate about things like Gaza and trans rights, for the police to be trying to get in the middle of that. I mean, the cold facts are, Joe, that the government, in its wisdom or otherwise, has proscribed Palestine Action. Therefore, it is against the law to support them, and the law enforcement organization in this country is the police. I mean, that's the simple answer to what you're saying. No, but it is these contested areas are, I can see the police's difficulty where there is not social consensus on those things like there is on paedophilia or violent burglary and stuff like that, where the police have the total support of the public.
Thing I would say about the arrest of this Graham Linehan, is that his name?
Yeah.
Is that, yeah, there is legislation in place to say that people who post offensive tweets need to be arrested. There's also legislation, of course, in place that says if people burgle your house, they should be arrested. And people shoplift, they should be arrested. But of course, the police say that they haven't got the resources to tackle those crimes. And so it was somewhat bemusing to me, Jim, to see that they did have 5 armed police officers able to go and arrest a middle-aged bloke who'd sent this distasteful tweet. And I think I'd go back to Joe's original point. Show a bit of bloody common sense.
Exactly.
Now, if you're going to arrest the guy, fine. Wait until he gets home. Send the bobby round. Give him his warning. Tell him he's got to report to the police station the next day. Don't be giving oxygen to the anti-woke brigade, pretending that this legislation has been driven by the Labour government. A lot of this legislation was put in place by the previous government, of course. And, one, again, being a bit conspiratorial, I suppose, is this a way of the police having a kick back at the government? Because, of course, they've not received the big uplift in resource and funding that they were hoping. And, you do wonder sometimes whether there is a political game going on from time to time, because there is no rhyme or reason as to why that arrest needed to take place immediately at Heathrow Airport, or indeed needing find officers to be involved in the guy's arrest. So, as I say, Jim, I think the points you made are reasonable, but equally, degree of common sense in these matters, I think, would take us an awful long way. Anyhow, we will be back in a week's time to talk about all things that are happening in the world of politics. In fact, we're going to be recording our podcast on Tuesday next week, because on Monday we will all be in the Palace of Westminster for Downtown in Business's parliamentary reception with the West Midlands Mayor Richard Parker and the Combined Authority, and 150 business leaders from across Birmingham and the wider city region as well. So I look forward to seeing you, Joe, at that particular event. James, you and I are going to be at the Property and Regeneration Conference in Manchester on Thursday, where we have an array of chief executives and local government leaders telling us all about their growth plans. I'm sure that everybody who will be attending that conference is looking forward to that. And then James has a really exciting weekend to look forward to, because it will be his first visit to that wonderful, magnificent stadium that is the Hill Dickinson Stadium, home of the mighty Blues. And Jack Grealish, Jim, I tell you, something special. Talk about king across the water, king across the Mersey, mate. Anyway,
looking forward to it.
Until next week, have a great 7 days. We'll see you very soon. Thanks for listening.